As a park ranger, I was used to spending time alone in the wilderness, but this solo patrol felt different from the start. An unseasonable chill hung in the late summer air as I hiked deeper into the remote Alaskan forest, my boots crunching on the carpet of dried pine needles. So I had volunteered for this week-long assignment, eager for solitude after a summer packed with guiding eco-tourists and coordinating search and rescue missions. Still, something about the silent forest set my nerves on edge. The usual chatter of squirrels and birdsong was oddly absent. Fully absent. Even the wind lay still, not a leaf rustling in the canopy above. After a few hours of steady hiking, I paused for a water break near a small stream. The crystal-clear water burbled softly as it flowed over mossy rocks, but no insects skimmed the surface. No trout darted in the shallows. Shaking off a shiver, I shrugged out of my heavy backpack and knelt to fill my canteen. As I screwed the cap back on, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision made me spin around, pulse racing. I squinted into the dim gaps between the towering spruce and hemlock trunks. Nothing moved. The back of my neck prickled with the uncanny certainty of being watched. I scanned the ferny undergrowth, the latticework of bare lower branches. Emptiness stared back at me. Unnerved, I stood and hefted my pack, suddenly eager to put more miles behind me before dusk fell. But as I turned to get my bearings, an uneasy jolt rolled through me. The trail had vanished. Creeping disorientation came over me as I turned in a slow circle. Dappled shadows blanketed the forest floor in all directions, concealing any trace of the path I'd been following all day. I pulled out my GPS unit and frowned at the screen. It showed me at least 2 miles off course, deep in a valley I didn't recognize on my maps. How was that possible? Temple. A crack like a snapping branch echoed from the silent woodland behind me. I spun toward the sound, my walking stick raised defensively in front of me. Straining to see into the gloom, I caught a waft of a rancid dead meat odor just before something pale whipped out of sight behind a massive trunk. Heart hammering, I edged backward until my pack bumped rough bark, eyes darting. My instincts screamed danger, urging me to run, but which way was safety? As the murky light faded towards night, all sense of direction deserted me. I was lost in the gathering dark, and I was no longer alone. Fog curled between the craggy trunks as I stumbled through the underbrush, following the stream downhill. My headlamp cast a feeble glow in the myopic darkness, illuminating mossy hummocks and veils of mist that parted before me like spectral cobwebs. Occasionally, I caught the gleam of animal eyes glinting beyond the edges of the light. But when I tried to focus on them, they winked out like doused coals. Only the spongy ground under my feet seemed real. I tried to concentrate on that tactile connection as the rising whine of whippoorwills swallowed my shallow breathing. When the whippoorwills fell abruptly silent, the lack of sound was somehow worse, a dead weight pressing against my eardrums. Then the wind picked up, sighing through invisible branches above me like a rasping breath. A fetid waft of carrion blew past me and I stumbled, nearly turning my ankle on a root. Reeling backwards, my light swept across the silty bank of the stream. A pair of tracks punctured the soft mud, unlike any animal prints I'd ever seen. Each was nearly as long as my hand, with 2 sharp toe pads and no visible heel impressions. They looked almost like oblong puncture wounds in the earth. Unease lapped at the edges of my exhaustion as I played my light over the steep slope above the stream. The strange tracks continued up into the trees, as if whatever creature left them had been walking on its hind legs. A large creature, judging by the depth of the imprints. But the stride was short, almost dainty. The hairs lifted on my nape as I tried and failed to reconcile the paradox. A twig snapped in the dead hush, so close that I almost yelped. I whirled, aiming my light upstream. In its narrow beam, a hunched figure stood on the bank facing me. An old man in a tattered coat, his form so blurred by mist that I couldn't make out his features beneath his battered hat. "You lost, girl," he called in a gravelly voice. I almost sobbed in relief at the sound of another human voice. Carissa. "Yes, I'm a ranger. My name is, best get yourself unlost." He cut me off, his tone flat and uninflected. "This ain't no place for your kind after dark." As he spoke, I caught a glimpse of his eyes glinting wetly in the darkness. A sudden wash of instinctive dread doused my relief, turning my skin to icy gooseflesh. "What?" I licked my lips, mouth gone bone dry. "What do you mean, my kind?" The old man let out a rusty bark of a laugh. You ain't from around here. Anybody local would know better than to be out past sunfall. Once the whippoorwill stopped singing, you're in Skinwalker territory. Skinwalker. The word shuddered through me on a tide of icy recognition. The taste of old ghost stories and tall tales from childhood camping trips. I'd never put much stock in tribal legends of shamans who could take on animal forms. But out here in the primordial forest, far from any other human heart, those fireside yarns took on the cold clarity of prophecy. I looked again at the strange tracks puncturing the bank. When I raised my eyes, the old man was gone, but the wind carried his parting words to me, rough as a raven's croak. If you hear your name on the night wind, girl, don't you answer. Once it's got your scent, it won't never let you go. Then the mist swirled and he was gone, leaving me alone with the rising whine of the whippoorwills and a creeping sense that I was being stalked by something that wore 1,000 faces and hungered for mine. The sickly green glow of my watch dial read just past midnight when the noises outside my tent changed. The night insects and bird calls that had lulled me into a restless doze stuttered, then stopped. In the ringing silence that followed, the susurration of my own breathing sounded deafening. I barely had time to register the gooseflesh prickling on my nape before something rustled the shell of my ultralight tent, a staccato motion, furtive and probing, there and gone again before I could scrabble for my headlamp. Hey, I meant it to come out as a bark of authority, but my voice cracked. This is a restricted area. You can't camp here. Sodium yellow light washed the interior of the tent as I flicked on my lantern. It puddled on the silver space blanket covering my sleeping bag, the scatter of my minimal supplies. No answering voice came from outside. Only a liquid gurgle that trailed into a throaty, keen, mournful, and inhuman. A coyote? The waver in the final note froze me in place, hands locked around the lantern handle. I knew that sound. I'd heard it once before on a nighttime patrol, when I'd stumbled across the matted remains of a hiker ripped apart by scavengers. It was the laughter of coyotes glutted on human flesh. Suddenly frantic to have a defensive wall against talons or teeth, I scrabbled in my bag for the bear spray I kept close in grizzly country. My fingers brushed a rectangle of plastic at the bottom of the pack. I pulled it out with a shaking hand. It was a battered driver's license, slimy with mud and leaf rot. A familiar face smiled blearily at me from the water-damaged ID photo. Jenna Parsons, age 24. She'd gone missing on a solo hiking trip last fall. I'd spent a hellish week combing these same woods as sleet fell and the trail finally went cold. A numb horror crept through me as I registered the other scattered contents that had fallen from my bag. A corroded compass engraved with initials that weren't mine. A scuffed utility knife, dark stains crusting the blade, trophies from the vanished, somehow secreted into my supplies as I slept. My breath sawed in my throat as I slowly raised the lantern to cast its betraying light into the dark beyond my tent. But as the shadows contracted, my gaze caught on something far worse than some nighttime scavengers circling my camp. The footprints pressed into the soft duff weren't human or animal. In the quivering lantern glow, they seemed to shift and elongate, stirring a primordial terror in my lizard brain. As I watched in petrified disbelief, the narrow claw marks flowing across the forest floor reshaped themselves into dozens of interlocked arms and legs. A writhing Mobius of sinew and grasping fingers. My own strangled shriek of revulsion snapped the spell. I scrambled out of the tent, swinging my lantern in a wide arc. The light bobbed erratically over serrated fern fronds, decaying nursery logs, a watching face. I froze, blinked, slowly lowered the beam. There at the edge of the trees, a familiar profile looked back at me. Jenna Parsons, her face white and still as a drowned thing just beneath the surface of a pond. Her mouth moved, shaping my name. A beckoning whisper swirled around me on the night wind. No, stumbling backwards. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Jenna was dead, her body cold in some lonely gully of this godforsaken forest. Fraying skeins of rationality unraveled as I tried desperately to blink away the apparition wearing my missing hiker's face. The thing that looked like Jenna took a sinuous step forward, and the illusion shattered. Wrongness flowed through the motion, a boneless fluidity. I could see the trees through the filmy outline of her form. A hiss trickled through the darkness as it spoke again, and this time I heard the words for what they were. Not my name, but a mocking approximation. A leer. With a choked whimper, I wrenched myself out of my paralysis and ran, crashing through the trees in a blind panic. Branches whipped my face and jabbed my ribs as I fled, bouncing off trunks and ripping through snarls of brambles. My headlamp flickered wildly, the beam strobing across dancing shadows as demonic laughter swelled behind me. I ran until my legs gave out and I sprawled in the loam, sobbing. The whippoorwills met my desperate gulps for air with silence. Overhead, unfamiliar stars glittered coldly in a vault of strange constellations. I was lost in a hostile wood that had swallowed me whole, stalked by something that wore dead faces. Morning felt very far away. I didn't remember falling into a dreamless sleep, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, weak sunlight was worming through my closed eyelids, and an echoing bird call wrenched me awake. I bolted upright, or tried to. The folds of my sleeping bag tangled around my legs, and I struggled against them in a panic before memory trickled back. My tent. I was zipped into my tent, safe in the false security of that nylon cocoon. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to steady my breathing. Just a dream, just a dream. Last night's blind flight through phantom trees had been conjured by my own overheated imagination, nerves strung too tightly by isolation and that eerie encounter with the old-timer. Or had it? With shaking hands, I reached for my backpack and unzipped it slowly. Flinching, I upended it onto my lap. A tin cup, a freeze-dried energy bar. My first aid kit, a coil of rope. The scatter of my ordinary supplies mocked me with its banality. No muddy driver's license. No blood-stained knife. I shook out the lining of the pack, probed every pocket. Nothing. "You're losing it, Danny," I muttered. The rasp in my own voice made me swallow hard. How long had it been since I'd spoken aloud? The days alone already blurred together. A sudden scuff of my boot against something hard snapped me out of my reverie. If I didn't rest soon, I'd collapse. The cabin, for all its dilapidated menace, offered shelter. A chance to get my bearings, maybe even find a map or a radio inside. Hating the defeated slump of my shoulders, I slogged across the clearing. Waist-high grass suzerated against my legs, heavy with dew and mist. By the time I reached the weathered stoop, my jeans were soaked through and my boots squished with each step. The door resisted my first tug, the warped wood groaning in its frame. For a second I thought it was locked, that I'd have to bust a window to gain entry. But as I threw my weight against it with mounting desperation, something gave with a screech of rusted metal and the door shuddered open. I nearly pitched headfirst into the dark maw of the cabin's interior. Stumbling, I caught myself on the rough lintel, splinters digging into my palms. Stale air puffed against my face, ripe with the sense of mildew and mouse droppings, and something else, something meaty and cloying that curdled my stomach. Fumbling for my headlamp, I flicked the beam over a jumble of overturned furniture, drifts of leaves, animal nests. And on the far wall, a shape that struggled to resolve itself into awful comprehension. A smear of something rusty brown, almost black in the colorless glare of my light. It forked into the crude outline of a body spread-eagled across. A sob hitched in my throat as I swept the beam lower. Gouges scored the silvered wood of 4 parallel slashes that ended in jagged punctures. Claw marks, some distant part of my mind gibbered. Talons raking and rending as they dragged their writhing prey into the dark. I backed toward the door on rubbery legs, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. This place was a tomb, a charnel house. The scene of some untold atrocity, the splatters too aged to be from an animal attack. As I scrabbled for the threshold, my foot struck something soft and yielding. I looked down in sudden superstitious dread. My stomach a hard cold knot against my spine. It was a backpack, the straps frayed as if chewed by rodents. The canvas was almost black with old bloodstains. Bile scalded the back of my throat, a scream building in my lung. But before it could tear loose, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision froze me in place. Slowly, I raised my head. There in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray light filtering through the trees, crouched a figure. Its form seemed to ripple and contort, muscles sliding liquidly beneath hairless skin, the ashen color of a bloodless corpse. As I watched in mute horror, unable to so much as draw breath to scream, the thing unfolded from its crouch and rose to a towering height. Stick-thin arms dangled at its sides, too many elbows bending at obscene angles. Its head tilted slowly, bird-like as if considering me. a featureless oval dominated by a lipless mouth and a pair of glinting, reptilian eyes. I fumbled for my bear spray, an old lecture on wildlife safety flitting inanely through my head. Make yourself big, shout, stand your ground. But some deep wailing terror in my lizard hindbrain howled that this thing would devour me without ever touching me, that no weapon forged by human hands could save me. It paced across the threshold, its elongated legs bending in ways that curdled my sanity. The door creaked shut behind it, and suddenly I knew with sinking certainty that I'd been herded here. This was where it fed, where it played with its food. A rasping hiss issued from its mouth, forked tongue flicking between rows of needle teeth. And in that sound I heard a single word, repeated over and over in a sibilant whisper. Skin.sick dealer. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my bear spray as I fumbled with the safety latch. The creature, the Skinwalker, cocked its head at the small hiss of pressurized gas escaping the canister. Its nostrils flared and a low clicking rose from its throat, like beetles scuttling over dry leaves. I swung the canister up, sighted down the barrel. For a single surreal second, I felt a bubble of hysterical laughter welling in my chest. Here I was, facing down a mythical monster with glorified pepper spray. If I survived this, I'd have to nominate myself for the world's most idiotic last stand. Stay back, I croaked, my voice a thready ruin. I'm warning you. In answer, the Skinwalker parted its lipless jaws and let out a guttural moan that almost sounded like laughter. Then it bunched its stick-thin limbs and sprang. I screamed and squeezed the trigger, orange mist billowing from the nozzle. The chemical stench seared my nostrils and stung my eyes, blinding me. But even through the watery blur, I saw the spray engulf the nightmare barreling toward me and pass right through it in a swirl of coalescing shadows. The Skinwalker's form shivered and dissolved like mist on the wind, only to reform an instant later, unfazed. It slammed into me with the boneless weight of something not quite flesh, not quite spirit. We went down in a tangle of thrashing limbs, the bear spray flying from my grip to clatter against the wall. Fetid breath billowed against my face, hot and reeking of carrion. Up close, I could see that the Skinwalker's hide was a patchwork of textures, sleek fur flowing seamlessly into mottled scales, membranous wings sprouting from its shoulders and melting back into the rippling mass of its body. Its claws sank into my arms, piercing canvas and skin as if my jacket were gossamer. I bucked and flailed beneath the thing's crushing weight, my boots skidding on the blood-slick floor. But I might as well have been fighting a landslide. Yeah, landslide. Slowly, inexorably, the Skinwalker lowered its head until its lamprey mouth brushed my ear. When it spoke, its voice was a crackling whisper, dry as snakeskin on stone. Bile scorched my throat, hot tears streaking my face. I threw every ounce of my failing strength into one last desperate heave. And by some miracle, I managed to twist free just enough to spot my salvation, my fallen canister of bear spray, lying in arm's reach against the blood-stained wall. I lunged for it, clawed fingers scrabbling. The Skinwalker let out a shriek of rage and raked my back, but I barely felt the pain. My fingers closed around the cool metal cylinder and I rolled onto my side, jamming the nozzle directly into the thing's gaping maw. This time my aim was true. The spray geyser down its throat, choking off its roar of fury. The creature reeled back, arms windmilling as it clawed at its face. I scrambled to my feet, staggering away in a stumbling run. But even with the reprieve, I knew it was hopeless. Where could I run that this creature couldn't follow? It had stalked me effortlessly through the trackless forest, wearing faces stolen from the dead. My only chance was to make a stand, to go down fighting, and then my gaze landed on the window set high in the cabin wall, grimy glass glinting dully. Beyond it, the pale ribbon of a logging road cut through the trees, threading off into the distance. Civilization, safety. It might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did me, but if I could break that window, attract attention somehow. The Skinwalker was hunched over retching, black ichor bubbling between its teeth. I didn't hesitate. It didn't hesitate. Snatching up a rusted lantern from the floor, I hurled it with all my strength. The glass shattered in a crystalline spray and I sucked air to scream. But before I could make a sound, a blur of shadow streaked across the room and slammed me back against the wall. Needle claws sank into my throat, throttling my cry. The Skinwalker loomed over me, its face rippling and contorting. For a heart-stopping moment, its features resolved into a grotesque collage, the leathery brow of the old man from the stream, Jenna's hazed eyes, the rictus of Trent Selway's skull. all the stolen skins it had ever worn, melting and flowing together in a obscene masquerade. No escape, it rasped, tightening its stranglehold, only the forever darkness. The edges of my vision crumbled into static as I sagged in its unbreakable grip. The last thing I saw before the void rose up to take me was the Skinwalker's mouth gaping wide, its jaws unhinging like a snake's to swallow my final breath. And then the world went black, and I knew nothing at all. Consciousness returned in throbbing fragments, pain splintering through my skull with every sluggish beat of my heart. I was lying on something cold and hard, rough wood digging into my back. Ribbon-thin bands of pressure cinched my wrists and ankles. No, not pressure. A circumflex bony fingers clamped around my limbs in an unbreakable vise. A cumflex. I cracked my eyes open and immediately wished I hadn't. The Skinwalker crouched over me, pinning me spread-eagled on the blood-stained floor. Pinning me spread-eagled on the blood-stained floor. In the guttering light of the rising moon filtering through the shattered window, I could see my own distorted reflection screaming silently in its mirrored eyes. Ah, little skin. Its voice was a grating rasp, thick with gloating. I will wear you so well, please. The word tore from my ravaged throat, tasting of blood and despair. Why are you doing this? For a long, lipless moment the creature regarded me. Then slowly, hideously, it smiled. I am what the ignorant call SS Skinwalker, it said. Ye old Lucia. Sus a shape changer. I hunt, I devour. And when the mood takes me, its voice changed, morphed into an obscene medley. The missing campers, their families, my own voice, echoing back at me from 1,000 miles away. I become. The breath hitched in my lungs as understanding crashed through me in a feverish wave. The creature wasn't just some mindless beast. It was a calculating predator, stalking human prey season after season to sate its twisted hunger. Killing was only the beginning of its dark appetites. It coveted our skins, our very identities, to wear like costumes in a depraved masquerade as it moved unseen among its chosen victims. Bile seared my throat as I thrashed weakly against its bruising grip. But I was a mouse pinned in a serpent's coils, my struggles only amusing my captor. The Skinwalker's grin widened until I could see down its gullet, a black abyss fringed with needles. I am eternal, it gloated. I am legion, and son, its jaws yawned wide. I will be you. But the footsteps stopped on the threshold and a gruff male voice called out, making me jerk against my restraints. This is Ranger Gunderson with the Park Service. Anybody in there? We got a report of screams coming from this location. My cracked lips worked soundlessly, helpless terror and desperate hope warring in my mangled throat. I had to warn him, had to make him understand the danger. But before I could unstick my tongue from the roof of my mouth, a soft, sibilant hiss froze my breath in my lungs. Foviques in my lungs. The Skinwalker's form pulsed and thickened, shadows slithering together like oil until its gaunt frame solidified into sickening familiarity. The battered hat of the old man from the stream, Jenna's dead eyes in a grinning rictus, a grotesque mummer's motley of its stolen faces. No trouble, Ranger. Its voice was a perfect mimic of the old man's gravelly rasp. Just a little misunderstanding with an unwanted guest. It glided to my side and curved a proprietary hand around my throat, claws dimpling the skin. I saw my own bulging eyes reflected in its glassy gaze, my mouth stretched in a rictus of mute horror. The ranger's hesitation was palpable, his unease a nearly tangible force. When he spoke again, there was a new wariness in his tone. I'm going to need you to step out here where I can see you. Keep your hands where I can see them. The Skinwalker's grin sharpened, needle teeth glinting in the shadows. But of course, no need for hostilities. It began to glide toward the door, its form rippling and contorting. I saw Jenna's face melt and run like wax, replaced by eyes that glinted with sly, reptilian hunger. In seconds, it would cross the threshold into the unsuspecting ranger, wearing a mask of innocence. And then the screaming would start. Desperation exploded through me, terror and fury fusing into a white-hot star. I wrenched against my bonds, tendons straining until I felt my wrists start to slicken with blood. The Skinwalker hissed a warning and tightened its claws around my throat, but I barely felt the sting. Run! The ranger's corpse toppled to the floor in a boneless sprawl, flooding the warped boards with crimson. Transfixed by horror, I couldn't look away as the creature crouched over its kill and sank its claws into the gaping ruin of the man's face. Skin and muscle sloughed away in glistening strips as it peeled back his features like a gruesome mask. Oh God, it was harvesting, adding the ranger's face to its grisly wardrobe. I must have made some tiny noise, a whimper or a sob. The skinwalker's head snapped up, torn mouth gaping in a blood-slick grin as it pinned me with its bottomless gaze. And now, little Alaskan, it hissed. Where were we? It prowled toward me, trailing loops of the ranger's intestines. My mind went blank with gibbering panic as I thrashed against my bonds, reopening the clotted wounds at my wrists. The skinwalker loomed over me, its jaws yawning impossibly wide, and froze as a blinding glare flooded the cabin. Headlights, twin suns blazing through the broken window. An amplified voice crackled over a loudspeaker. "This is the police. Come out with your hands up." The skinwalker shrieked its rage to the rafters, caught between its two halves as the stark beams pinned it in place. I could see the police taking positions outside, silhouettes behind the painful dazzle. Someone must have heard the shot, called 911. I lurched forward with the last of my strength and sank my teeth into the skinwalker's arm. It reared back with a spitting cry, talons ripping free of my flesh. I hit the floor hard, black stars swimming across my vision. Then all hell broke loose as the police stormed the cabin. The skinwalker howled and spun, a dervish of shadows and slashing claws. Gunfire boomed in the close quarters as it fell on the officers in a whirlwind of gore, bullets pocking its mist flesh. I belly crawled across the blood-slick floor, pulse a staccato thunder in my ears. My numb fingers fumbled over the ranger's belt until they closed around the hilt of his survival knife. I gripped it like a talisman as I sawed through my bonds, teeth bared against the searing pain. The skinwalker was an avatar of destruction, unhindered by wounds that would have felled any mortal thing. But even it couldn't stand against the onslaught forever. I saw it stagger beneath the hail of gunfire, its form shivering and thinning. More mist than flesh now as bullets tore through it in sprays of shadowy ichor. It screamed its hate and defiance as it fell back, clawing for the window. The police shouted in confusion, unable to credit what their eyes insisted was impossible. They couldn't stop it, I saw with sinking certainty. It would flow away into the darkness between seconds, to slink off and lick its wounds, to hunt again, unless my hand closed around the fallen canister of bear spray. My muscles jumped and spasmed as I hauled myself upright, nearly toppling with the weight of my battered body. Time seemed to slow as I raised my arm, sighted down the nozzle at the skinwalker's back. It was half turned away, a seething mass of shadow with the barest dregs of stolen faces melting across its surface. I saw Jenna's mouth twist, the old man's milky eyes roll to fix hungrily on me. "Hey," my ravaged voice cracked. "Chew on this, you bastard." I pressed the release and the spray jetted out in a stinging mist, just as one of the officers fired a round straight through the skinwalker's chest. The bullet passed through its foggy flesh and straight into the bear spray canister. The world went white. The skinwalker's scream rose to an unbearable crescendo, laced with a shriek of tortured metal as the canister ruptured. Searing, chemical-laced mist gazered over the creature, catching light from the headlights outside. It went up like a torch, flames gouting from its eye sockets, from the gaping maw of its mouth. The skinwalker thrashed and flailed. A mass of boiling shadow shot through with streaks of orange, of devouring heat. Its wail spiraled up and up, an unholy melding of the voices it had stolen. The old Chevy pickup groaned as I guided it down the winding dirt road, kicking up plumes of dust that billowed behind me like spectral fingers reaching out from the earth. The dense canopy of trees overhead seemed to swallow what little remained of the day's light, plunging the world around me into an oppressive darkness that even my headlights struggled to penetrate. My name is Jack Hawkins, and I've been hunting these woods since I was old enough to hold a rifle. But tonight, as I ventured deeper into the heart of Blackwood Forest, an unsettling feeling gnawed at the pit of my stomach. Something was different. Something was wrong. The chill of the autumn air seeped through my worn leather jacket, biting at my skin despite the layers I wore beneath. But it wasn't just the cold that made me shiver. It was the eerie stillness that hung over the forest like a shroud. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted, no creatures rustled in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I was here to hunt, just like any other night. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be like any other night. Not after what had happened in these parts over the last couple of years. It had started with whispers, stories passed around campfires and in the corners of local bars, tales of strange noises in the night, of shadows moving where no shadows should be. At first, we'd all laugh them off as the product of too much whiskey and overactive imaginations. But then people started disappearing. It wasn't just the occasional hiker who'd wandered off the trail or the inexperienced camper who'd gotten lost. These were experienced outdoorsmen and women, people who knew Blackwood Forest like the back of their hand. They'd go out for a hunt or a camping trip, and they'd never come back. Search parties would find their campsites untouched, their gear left behind as if they'd just stepped away for a moment. But there was never any trace of where they'd gone. The local authorities chalked it up to animal attacks or accidents, but we all knew better. Something was out there in the woods, something that didn't belong. And then, a month ago, it happened to my cousin, Mike. We'd grown up together, spent countless weekends exploring every nook and cranny of Blackwood Forest. Mike could track a deer through a blizzard and find his way out of the densest thicket without breaking a sweat. When they found his campsite abandoned, his rifle still propped against a tree, we all knew something was terribly wrong. The search party found his footprints leading into a clearing about a mile from his camp, and then nothing. It was as if he'd been plucked right off the ground. No signs of struggle, no blood, no drag marks, just gone. That's why I was out here tonight. Mike's wife, Karen, had called me earlier that week. She couldn't bring herself to go out to their cabin, a small place about 10 miles from where Mike had disappeared. It had been in his family for generations, a retreat from the world where he'd go to recharge. Karen asked if I could check on it, make sure everything was all right. It was the least I could do. As I rounded a bend in the road, the cabin came into view. It was a simple structure, weathered wood siding blending seamlessly with the surrounding forest. I cut the engine and sat there for a moment listening. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I grabbed my rifle from the passenger seat and stepped out of the truck, the doors creak sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. The air was frigid, each breath visible in small puffs of vapor. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing to see, just darkness and the unsettling feeling of being watched. The porch groaned under my weight as I made my way to the door. It was unlocked, just as Karen had said it would be. I pushed it open slowly, wincing at the protesting screech of the hinges. Inside, it was just as I remembered from my last visit. A wood stove sat in one corner, a small table with a couple of chairs in another. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of damp wood and old smoke. I flipped the light switch and a single bulb flickered to life, casting weak yellow light over the room. Setting my rifle on the table, I began to check the place out. Everything seemed to be in order, untouched since Mike's last visit. But as I stood by the window, looking out into the impenetrable darkness of the forest, the unease that had been gnawing at me since I arrived began to grow. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction it was coming from, but it seemed to be all around me. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I held my breath, listening for any sign of movement. But the woods had gone deathly quiet again. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Grabbing my rifle, I decided to do a quick check around the cabin before settling in for the night. The sooner I could get this over with, the sooner I could get back to the relative safety of my truck and the world beyond Blackwood Forest. As I stepped out onto the porch, the cold air hit me like a physical blow. I started to walk the perimeter, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The beam from my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the rough bark of the trees and the underbrush that seemed to shift and sway just beyond the light's reach. I had made it about halfway around the cabin when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There, on the ground, partially hidden by the tall grass, was a set of footprints. They were larger than any man's I had ever seen, and they led away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees. My heart raced as I tightened my grip on the rifle. No one should be out here. No one except for me. I stood there staring at the footprints, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They were deep, as if whatever had made them was incredibly heavy, and the grass around them was flattened, like something had been dragged behind it. For the first time in years, I felt genuine fear grip me. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. But I had to know. I had to see where they led. Started to follow the tracks, moving slowly and carefully, my flashlight sweeping back and forth across the ground. The footprints led deeper into the woods, away from the cabin, and I followed them, my pulse pounding in my ears. The trees closed in around me, their branches forming a twisted maze that seemed to go on forever. The further I went, the darker it got, until the light from my flashlight was barely enough to see by. That's when I found it. The tracks stopped suddenly, right in the middle of a small clearing. There was no sign of whatever had made them, but there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing, half buried in the dirt, was what looked like a piece of cloth. I knelt down, brushing away the dirt with shaking hands, and uncovered what was left of a jacket. Mike's jacket. My mind went blank, and for a moment, I couldn't move. This was where it had happened. This was where it had happened. This was where he had disappeared. But there was no sign of him. No blood, no struggle, just the jacket and those massive footprints. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and looked around, trying to figure out what to do next. But before I could make a decision, I heard it again. The rustling louder this time, coming from the trees around me. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. The rustling grew louder, closer, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest. Whatever was out there, it was coming for me. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The rustling followed me, growing louder and more frantic until it was all I could hear. I burst out of the trees and into the clearing around the cabin, my lungs burning from the effort. I didn't stop until I reached the porch, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. I stood there gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door, listening for any sign of movement outside. But there was nothing, just silence. I slowly backed away from the door, my heart still pounding in my chest. The cabin felt small, suffocating, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. I had to get out of there. I had to leave. I grabbed my rifle and headed for the back door, but before I could reach it, I heard a noise that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural sound coming from just outside the cabin. Something was out there, something big, and it was close. I froze, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. I could hear it moving now, its heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. It was circling the cabin, and I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me. I knew I couldn't stay there. Whatever it was hunting me. And if I didn't move, it would find me. I turned and bolted for the back door, throwing it open and sprinting out into the night. I didn't stop to look back. I just ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs burning with the effort. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the trees, gaining on me with every step. I could see the truck up ahead, its headlights still on, a beacon of safety in the darkness. I pushed myself harder, willing my legs to move faster, my heart pounding in my ears. I reached the truck, yanching the door open and throwing myself inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the keys. I fumbled with the ignition, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and finally managed to start the engine. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning on the gravel before they caught, and the truck lurched forward. I didn't look back as I tore down the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. It wasn't until I was miles away, the trees thinning out and the lights of the town coming into view, that I finally let myself breathe. I didn't know what had happened back there or what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. Whatever was out there in those woods, it had taken Mike, and it had almost taken me. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to know. As I drove into town, my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. People needed to know what was out there, lurking in the shadows of Blackwood Forest. I drove straight to the sheriff's office, my hands still shaking as I parked the truck. Deputy Thompson was on duty, his eyebrows rising in surprise as I burst through the door. "Jack, what in the world are you doing here at this hour? You look like you've seen a ghost." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Tom, we need to talk. Something's out there in Blackwood Forest. Something, I don't even know how to describe it. I spent the next hour telling Deputy Thompson everything that had happened. The footprints, Mike's jacket, the thing that had chased me through the woods. As I spoke, I could see the skepticism in his eyes, but he listened patiently. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a troubled look on his face. Jack, I know you've been through a lot, especially with Mike's disappearance, but what you're describing, it's hard to believe. It's hard to believe. Are you sure you didn't imagine some of this? I felt a surge of anger. Damn it, Tom. I know what I saw. This isn't just about Mike. People have been disappearing in those woods for years now. How many more have to vanish before you take this seriously? Deputy Thompson held up his hands in a placating gesture. All right, I hear you. Look, I'll talk to the sheriff in the morning. We'll send a team out to the cabin, see if we can find any evidence of what you saw. But Jack, you need to keep this to yourself for now. The last thing we need is a panic. I nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted. As I stood to leave, Deputy Thompson put a hand on my shoulder. Get some rest, Jack, and be careful. Whatever's going on out there, it's clear that Blackwood Forest isn't safe right now. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Whatever was out there in the woods, it wasn't going to stop with Mike, and I had a sinking feeling that I was now on its radar. I pulled into my driveway, the familiar sight of my house doing little to calm my nerves. As I stepped out of the truck, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see a hulking shape emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the quiet street and the distant sound of a dog barking. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me and checking every window. Only when I was sure the house was secure did I allow myself to collapse onto the couch, my body finally giving in to the exhaustion. As I sat there in the darkness, my mind kept replaying the events of the night. The massive footprints, the inhuman sounds, the feeling of being hunted. I knew that sleep would be impossible, but I also knew that I couldn't just sit here and do nothing. I got up and went to my study, pulling out maps of Blackwood Forest and surrounding areas. If there was something out there, something that had been taking people for years, there had to be a pattern, a place where it lived or hunting grounds it favored. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, I had circled every reported disappearance, every strange sighting, every unexplained event in the area over the past decade, and a pattern was emerging. A rough circle, centered on a part of the forest so remote and rugged that even the most experienced hunters rarely ventured there. If there was a lair, a place where this thing, whatever it was called home, that had to be it. I knew what I had to do. The sheriff's office might not believe me, might not take this seriously enough, but I couldn't just sit back and wait for more people to disappear. I had to go back. I had to find proof. As I began to gather supplies, my mind drifted to Mike. Had he stumbled upon something out there? Had he too been on the verge of uncovering this dark secret lurking in the heart of Blackwood Forest? I didn't know what I would find out there, or if I would even make it back. But I knew one thing for certain: the hunt was on, and this time I wasn't going to be the prey. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows through the trees, I loaded up my truck with supplies. Maps, food, water, first aid kit, flashlights, extra batteries, and of course, my trusty rifle. I knew I was probably crazy for going back out there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't do something, more people would disappear. I left a note for my wife, telling her I was going on a hunting trip and would be back in a few days. It wasn't entirely a lie, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. She'd think I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had. The drive back to Blackwood Forest was tense. Every mile that brought me closer to those woods made my heart beat a little faster. But I steeled myself, focusing on the task at hand. I had a plan. I'd start at Mike's cabin and work my way towards the area I'd identified on the map, the place where I believed this thing might be hiding. As I pulled up to the cabin, memories of the previous night came flooding back. The massive footprints, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush, the gut-wrenching fear as I fled for my life. I took a deep breath, gripped my rifle tightly, and stepped out of the truck. The forest was quiet, but not with the unnatural stillness of the night before. Birds chirped in the distance, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. It was almost peaceful, which somehow made it even more unsettling. I made my way to where I'd found the footprints the night before. In the harsh light of day, they seemed even more impossible. Beautiful. Each print was easily twice the size of my own foot, with strange, elongated toes that ended in what looked like claw marks. I took photos with my phone, making sure to place my own boot next to one for scale. So, following the tracks, I found myself back at the clearing where I'd discovered Mike's jacket. I searched the area thoroughly, looking for any clue I might have missed in the darkness. That's when I noticed something glinting in the sunlight, half buried in the soft earth. I knelt down and carefully brushed away the dirt. It was a watch, Mike's watch. The face was cracked and the hands had stopped at 11:17. I remembered Mike telling me he always set his watch a few minutes fast, which meant whatever had happened to him. It had occurred just after 11 p.m. It had occurred just after 11 p.m. I pocketed the watch and continued my search. As the day wore on, I found more disturbing signs. Claw marks on trees, patches of fur caught on branches, and worst of all, what looked like drag marks leading deeper into the forest. As I followed these signs, the woods grew denser, darker. The trees here were old, their gnarled branches twisting together to block out much of the sunlight. The air grew colder, and an oppressive silence fell over the forest. No birds sang here, no insects buzzed. It was as if all life avoided this place. That's when I saw it. In a small clearing ahead, barely visible through the trees, was what looked like the entrance to a cave. But there was something off about it. The opening was too perfectly round, the edges too smooth. It looked less like a natural formation and more like a burrow, a massive, unnatural burrow. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached. The ground around the entrance was littered with bones, deer, rabbits, and to my horror, what looked like human remains. I swallowed hard, fighting back the urge to run. I had to know. I had to see what was inside. Turning on my flashlight, I took a tentative step into the cave. The beam of light revealed a tunnel sloping downward, disappearing into darkness. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and covered in a strange, slimy substance. The air was thick with a musty animal odor that made my eyes water. I had only gone a few feet when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. It was followed by the sound of something large moving in the darkness ahead. Something was coming. I backpedaled out of the cave, my heart racing. As I emerged into the fading daylight, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. As something massive and dark moving with impossible speed through the trees. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of long razor-sharp claws, of eyes that glowed with an otherworldly intelligence. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I could hear it behind me, gaining ground with every second. The truck was still too far away. I wasn't going to make it. In desperation, I spun around, raising my rifle. The creature burst from the trees, a nightmarish amalgamation of bear and wolf, but larger than either, with a face that was almost human. I fired, the sound of the shot echoing through the forest. The beast roared in pain and fury, but it didn't go down. It charged at me, and I fired again and again, emptying the rifle. Just as it was about to reach me, it stumbled and fell, skidding to a stop mere feet away. I stood there shaking as the creature's labored breathing slowly ceased. It was dead. I had killed it. But as I looked at its massive form, at the intelligence still visible in its now lifeless eyes, I knew this wasn't over. This couldn't be the only one. With trembling hands, I took out my phone and started taking pictures, documenting everything. Then I called Deputy Thompson. "Tom," I said when he answered, my voice hoarse, "you need to get out here, now, and bring backup. Lots of backup." The next few hours were a blur. Police swarmed the area, forensic teams collected evidence, and I told my story over and over to increasingly high-ranking officials. They found more bodies in the cave, including, to my sorrow, the remains of my cousin Mike. As night fell, I sat on the tailgate of my truck, watching as they loaded the creature's body into a large truck. Deputy Thompson walked up, his face pale. "Jack," he said, his voice low, "I owe you an apology. We should have listened to you sooner. Maybe if we had—" I shook my head. "We can't change the past, Tom, but we can make sure this never happens again." He nodded grimly. "The higher-ups are already talking about a full-scale operation. Whatever these things are, we're going to hunt them down." As I drove home that night, exhausted and battered, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. We had uncovered a secret, something that had been hidden in the depths of Blackwood Forest for who knows how long, and I had a feeling that secret wasn't going to go down without a fight. The forest may have taken my cousin, may have almost taken me, but now it was our turn to be the hunters. Our turn to be the hunters. And as I pulled into my driveway, seeing the worried face of my wife at the window, I made a silent vow. Whatever it took, however long it took, I would see this through to the end. For Mike, for all the others who had been lost, and for the safety of everyone who called this place home. The hunt was far from over, but this time we were ready, and this time we would be the predators, not the prey.